In the quiet halls of a hospital that never sleeps, a nurse finds comfort in anonymous notes left after her toughest shifts. Sweet, precise words that touch her soul, as if someone truly sees everything she feels. What she doesn't know is that behind that elegant handwriting is the watchful gaze of the most powerful man in the building, someone who has never shown emotion until now. Get ready for a story where love blooms between the lines and changes everything. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital hummed their familiar tune as Isabella Chen made her way through the quiet corridors of the night shift. Her small frame moved with practiced grace, white sneakers silent against the polished floors. At 28, she had the delicate features of a porcelain doll, but her colleagues knew better than to mistake her gentle appearance for weakness. Isabella possessed an inner strength that had carried her through countless difficult nights in these hallways. She paused at room 314, where elderly Mrs. Patterson lay restlessly in her bed. The woman's breathing was labored, her eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes with facing the unknown in the darkness. "Can't sleep again?" Isabella whispered, approaching the bedside with the soft smile that had become her trademark. She didn't wait for an answer, simply reaching out to take the frail hand in hers. "Let me tell you about the garden outside my apartment. The roses are blooming now, and they smell like heaven itself." As Isabella spoke in gentle tones about ordinary beautiful things, Mrs. Patterson's breathing gradually steadied. The fear in her eyes melted away, replaced by the peaceful expression of someone finally finding comfort. This was Isabella's gift, the ability to bring light into the darkest moments with nothing more than her presence and genuine care. "You're an angel, dear," Mrs. Patterson murmured as her eyelids grew heavy. "I don't know what we'd do without you." Isabella stayed until the woman's breathing deepened into natural sleep, then quietly slipped out of the room. She made her way to the nurse's station, where the familiar routine of checking charts and preparing medications awaited her. It was during these quiet moments, when the hospital settled into its nighttime rhythm, that she allowed herself to dream about her future. If this story is touching your heart, show your support, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Every action helps us keep bringing you new stories full of emotion. The promotion to head nurse was within reach. After 5 years of night shifts, double overtime, and pouring her heart into every patient interaction, the position represented everything she had worked toward. It would mean better hours, higher pay, and most importantly, the opportunity to implement the compassionate care standards she believed every patient deserved. As she reached into the pocket of her scrubs for a pen, her fingers brushed against something unexpected, a piece of paper, folded with careful precision. Isabella's heart skipped as she unfolded it, recognizing the elegant handwriting that had become both a mystery and a comfort over the past 2 weeks. "Your dedication illuminates the darkest corridors of this place. Continue being that light. The patients don't just need your medical care, they need your heart, and you give it freely every single night." No signature, just like all the others. Just words that seemed to see directly into her soul, understanding exactly what she needed to hear after the most challenging moments of her work. Isabella looked around the empty nurses' station, searching for any clue about who might have left this latest message. The night cleaning crew had finished their rounds an hour ago. The attending physicians were all either sleeping in the on-call rooms or making their final rounds. Who could possibly know about the difficult case she'd handled earlier that evening, when young Timothy Rodriguez had cried for his mother after his surgery? She pressed the note against her chest, feeling her heartbeat quicken. Whoever was writing these messages understood her in a way that felt both thrilling and slightly unsettling. They saw her dedication, her struggles, her small victories that no one else seemed to notice. 3 floors above, in the executive administrative wing, Alexander Morrison stood at his office window, gazing down at the city lights below. At 38, he cut an imposing figure, 6 feet 3 inches of carefully controlled power, with broad shoulders that filled out his tailored suits and hands, that had once been trained to save lives but now held the weight of running his family's hospital empire. His reflection in the window showed the sharp angles of his jaw, the honey-colored eyes that could make grown men shift uncomfortably during board meetings, and the dark hair that he kept meticulously styled even during his late-night administrative rounds. Alexander Morrison was a man who demanded perfection from himself and everyone around him, a trait that had served him well in transforming St. Mary's from a struggling community hospital into one of the most respected medical facilities in the region. But tonight, like every night for the past month, his thoughts weren't focused on profit margins or efficiency reports. They were 3 floors below, following a petite nurse with dark hair and the most compassionate eyes he'd ever seen. He had been making his routine administrative walkthrough when he first saw her. Isabella Chen, according to her badge, though he had memorized her name long before reading it. She had been comforting a frightened child who had been brought in after a playground accident, singing softly while the pediatric team prepared for minor surgery. Alexander had found himself frozen in the doorway, watching as she transformed a terrifying experience into something manageable for a scared little boy. That night, he had returned to his office and done something completely out of character. He had written a note, not an administrative memo or business correspondence, but something personal, something that acknowledged the extraordinary compassion he had witnessed. Alexander ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of uncertainty from a man who had built his reputation on unwavering confidence. He had never been good with words spoken aloud, particularly when emotions were involved. But writing, that was different. On paper, he could express the admiration and growing fascination that Isabella inspired in him. The desk lamp cast a warm glow over his office as he sat down and pulled out a sheet of his personal stationery. His pen hovered over the paper for several minutes before he began to write in the careful script he had practiced since childhood. Tomorrow night, there would be another note waiting for Isabella Chen. And perhaps, just perhaps, he would find the courage to do more than observe her from the shadows. But tonight, Alexander Morrison, the man who commanded boardrooms and made million-dollar decisions without hesitation, sat in his office writing love letters to a woman who didn't even know his name. The elevator hummed softly as it ascended to the 7th floor, carrying Isabella toward another night that promised to test every ounce of strength she possessed. She smoothed her scrubs with nervous hands, thinking about the conversation she'd had with the head of nursing earlier that day. The promotion decision would be announced soon, and the competition was fierce. Sarah Mitchell, with her 15 years of experience, and Robert Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, with his impressive credentials from prestigious hospitals, were both formidable candidates. Isabella closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability that she would never show her colleagues. She wanted this promotion more than she had ever wanted anything in her professional life. It wasn't just about the recognition or the salary increase, though both would be life-changing. It was about having the authority to implement the patient care standards she believed in, to ensure that every person who walked through St. Mary's doors received not just medical treatment, but genuine compassion. The elevator dinged softly, and the doors began to slide open. Isabella stepped forward, then froze as she nearly collided with someone entering from the hallway. Her eyes traveled up, way up, from polished Italian leather shoes to an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, finally meeting a pair of honey-colored eyes that seemed to look right through her. Alexander Morrison, the hospital's owner-administrator, a man whose reputation preceded him through every corridor of St. Mary's. Isabella had seen him from a distance during staff meetings and administrative announcements, but never this close. Never close enough to notice the way his eyes seemed to hold secrets, or the subtle scent of his cologne that spoke of expensive tastes and careful attention to detail. "I'm sorry," she stammered, stepping back to give him room to enter the elevator. "I wasn't paying attention." "No need to apologize," Alexander replied, his voice carrying the kind of controlled authority that made people listen without question. But Isabella caught something else in his tone, a gentleness that seemed at odds with his intimidating reputation. "Which floor?" "7," she managed, acutely aware of how small the elevator suddenly seemed with his imposing presence filling it. Alexander pressed the button, though she noticed his finger hesitated for just a moment. As the elevator began its ascent, Isabella found herself stealing glances at his profile. There was something classical about his features, as if he had stepped out of a Renaissance painting. His jaw was strong and clean-shaven, his dark hair styled with precision that suggested he paid attention to every detail of his appearance. "You're Isabella Chen," he said suddenly, causing her heart to skip. "From the night shift nursing staff." Isabella turned to face him fully, surprised that he knew her name. "Yes, sir. I didn't realize you knew who I was." "I make it my business to know the staff who make a difference," Alexander replied, his eyes meeting hers briefly before he looked away. "Your patient satisfaction scores are exceptional. The feedback from families consistently mentions your compassionate care." Heat rose in Isabella's cheeks. She had no idea that her work was being noticed at such a high level. "Thank you, sir. That means a great deal coming from you." The elevator slowed as it approached the 7th floor, and Isabella felt an unexpected disappointment that their conversation was ending. There was something about Alexander Morrison that intrigued her. Beneath the intimidating exterior, she sensed a complexity that didn't match his reputation as a cold, business-focused administrator. "Isabella," he said, as the doors began to open, causing her to pause in the doorway. She turned back to find his honey-colored eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Keep doing what you're doing. St. Mary's is fortunate to have you." "Thank you, Mr. Morrison," she whispered, then stepped out of the elevator on legs that felt suddenly unsteady. As the doors closed behind her, Isabella stood in the hallway for a full minute, her heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with the caffeine from her evening coffee. There had been something in his eyes, something that made her feel as though he saw her, really saw her, in a way that few people ever had. Alexander remained in the elevator long after the doors closed, his carefully maintained composure shaken by the brief encounter. Up close, Isabella was even more captivating than he had observed from his distant vantage points. Her dark eyes held depths of kindness that seemed almost luminous, and when she smiled, it was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. He had memorized every word of their conversation, knowing he would replay it countless times in the hours to come. The way she had stammered slightly when nervous, the graceful movement of her hands as she smoothed her scrubs, the genuine surprise and pleasure in her voice when he complimented her work, all of it was now permanently etched in his memory. The elevator reached his floor, but Alexander didn't immediately step out. Instead, he stood there thinking about the note he had left for her the previous evening, wondering if she had found it yet, if his words had brought her comfort after what he knew had been a particularly challenging shift. Through his administrative rounds, Alexander had witnessed Isabella's interaction with Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman struggling with anxiety about her upcoming surgery. He had watched from the doorway, as Isabella sat with her for nearly an hour after her shift should have ended, holding her hand and speaking in gentle tones about ordinary, beautiful things, until the woman finally found peace. It was in that moment that Alexander had realized his professional admiration for Isabella's work had transformed into something far more personal and complicated. She possessed a rare combination of professional competence and genuine heart that drew him like a magnet. But the distance between them, professional, social, and emotional, seemed insurmountable, which was why he had begun writing the notes. In the safety of anonymous words, he could express the admiration and growing affection that he could never voice in person. Through carefully crafted messages, he could tell her that her dedication was seen and valued, that her compassion made a difference in ways she might never fully realize. Alexander finally stepped out of the elevator, his mind already composing the next note he would leave for Isabella. Tonight, he had seen her up close, had spoken with her, had looked into those remarkable eyes that haunted his thoughts, and while he still couldn't find the courage to reveal his identity as her mysterious correspondent, the encounter had only strengthened his resolve to continue finding ways to let her know that someone understood the extraordinary person she was. As he walked toward his office, Alexander Morrison, the man who had never struggled to command respect or achieve his goals, found himself completely undone by a petite night nurse who brought light to the darkest corners of his world, one patient at a time. 3 floors below, Isabella began her rounds with a lightness in her step that hadn't been there in weeks. The brief encounter in the elevator had left her with a curious sense of anticipation, as though something significant had shifted in her carefully ordered world. She didn't yet understand what it meant, but she found herself looking forward to discovering where this new feeling might lead. Isabella's fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the 3rd note she had discovered in as many days. This time she had found it tucked carefully between the pages of the patient chart she was reviewing, placed with such precision that only she would notice it during her routine medication checks. "Last night, I watched you calm Mr. Henderson's fears about his cardiac procedure with nothing more than your gentle voice and steady presence. You have a gift that transcends medical training, the ability to heal hearts along with bodies. Never doubt the profound impact you have on every life you touch. Isabella sank into the chair at the nurse's station, her heart racing as she read the words again. Whoever was writing these messages wasn't just observing her work from a distance. They were seeing intimate moments of patient care that occurred in the quiet hours of the night shift. The specificity of the observations both thrilled and unnerved her. Mr. Henderson had indeed been terrified about his upcoming surgery. Isabella had spent nearly 2 hours with him, sharing stories about her own father's successful cardiac procedure years earlier, holding his hand while he called his daughter in California, and simply being present while he processed his fears. How could someone have witnessed those private moments without her noticing? She looked around the dimly lit nurse's station, suddenly hyper-aware of every shadow, every corner where someone might observe without being seen. The mystery writer clearly had access to areas of the hospital that most staff couldn't reach, a knowledge of her schedule that suggested careful attention to her routine. A soft chime from her phone interrupted her thoughts. A text from her best friend, Maria, who worked the day shift in pediatrics. "Coffee tomorrow before my shift? I have gossip about the incredibly handsome doctor who keeps asking about you." Isabella's eyebrows rose. She quickly typed back, "What doctor? And what do you mean asking about me?" The response came immediately. "Dr. James Whitmore from Emergency. Tall, blonde, divorced, and apparently very interested in a certain night nurse with beautiful dark eyes. He's been asking everyone about your schedule." Isabella stared at her phone, feeling a mix of flattery and mild discomfort. Dr. Whitmore was undeniably attractive and had always been professional and kind during their interactions. But something about the idea of him making inquiries about her felt presumptuous, especially when her thoughts were already occupied by her mysterious correspondent. 3 floors above, Alexander stood at his office window, ostensibly reviewing quarterly reports, but actually watching Isabella's reflection in the glass doors of the nurse's station below. Even from this distance, he could see the gentle concentration on her face as she worked, the graceful way she moved between patients' rooms, the soft smile she offered to everyone she encountered. He had left tonight's note with particular care, timing his placement perfectly to coincide with her medication rounds. Alexander had memorized her schedule with the thoroughness he usually reserved for business acquisitions, noting every pattern, every routine that might give him opportunities to leave his messages without detection. The memory of their elevator encounter 2 days earlier played constantly in his mind. Her voice soft and slightly nervous when she spoke to him, the way her dark eyes had widened when he complimented her work, the delicate flush that had colored her cheeks when she realized he knew her name. Every detail was seared into his consciousness with startling clarity. Alexander had built his professional reputation on being decisive and direct, but Isabella Chen had reduced him to writing anonymous love letters, like a schoolboy with his first crush. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who commanded million-dollar board meetings was too nervous to simply introduce himself properly to the woman who had captured his heart. A knock at his office door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, turning away from the window with reluctance. His assistant, Margaret, entered with her usual efficient smile. "Mr. Morrison, Dr. Whitmore from Emergency has requested a meeting with you tomorrow morning. He mentioned wanting to discuss some staffing recommendations." Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. James Whitmore had been making waves lately, subtly politicking for more administrative influence and questioning some of the hospital's patient care policies. The man was competent enough as a physician, but his ambition often rubbed Alexander the wrong way. "What time?" Alexander asked, his tone carefully neutral. 9 a.m., sir." He was quite insistent about the urgency. "Fine. Schedule it." Alexander dismissed Margaret with a nod, but his mind was already working. Whitmore's sudden interest in staff recommendations felt suspiciously timed, especially given what Alexander had noticed about the doctor's increased presence on the night shift floors lately. Alexander had observed Whitmore's interactions with Isabella during shift changes, noting the way the doctor's eyes followed her movements, the slightly too long conversations about routine matters, the casual questions about her schedule that other staff members seemed to find normal. But that set Alexander's teeth on edge. The possessive feelings that surged through him were entirely inappropriate and completely beyond his control. Isabella wasn't his to protect, wasn't his to claim, wasn't even aware of his existence beyond their brief elevator encounter. But the thought of James Whitmore pursuing her with his practiced charm and conventional good looks filled Alexander with a jealousy so sharp it was almost physical. Meanwhile, Isabella finished her rounds and found herself drawn back to the mysterious note. She had started keeping them in a small box in her locker, reading them during her breaks like treasured letters from a beloved friend. The words provided comfort during her most challenging moments and encouragement when self-doubt crept in. Tonight, however, she made a decision that surprised even herself. Taking out a piece of paper, she began to write a response. To my mysterious correspondent, your words have been a source of strength during some very difficult nights. I want you to know that your kindness hasn't gone unnoticed or unappreciated. Whoever you are, wherever you are, thank you for seeing me, really seeing me, in a way that few people ever have. If you're comfortable revealing yourself, I'd very much like to thank you in person. If not, please know that your notes are treasured. Isabella. She folded the note carefully and placed it in the same location where she always found her messages, her heart pounding with nervous anticipation. For the first time in 2 weeks, she was taking an active role in this mysterious correspondence, and the possibility of finally meeting her anonymous admirer both thrilled and terrified her. As her shift neared its end, Isabella found herself checking the message location compulsively, wondering if her response would be discovered, if it would be answered, if her boldness would end the beautiful mystery that had brought such unexpected light into her routine. She had no way of knowing that 4 floors above, Alexander Morrison sat in his office, composing tomorrow night's note with even more care than usual, completely unaware that for the first time, Isabella was trying to reach back across the distance between them. Alexander arrived at his office earlier than usual the next morning, his mind focused on the note Isabella had left in response to his latest message. He had discovered it during his late-night administrative rounds, and reading her words had sent his heart racing with a mixture of joy and panic. She wanted to meet him. The thought both thrilled and terrified him in equal measure. Alexander studied her handwriting, neat feminine script that somehow perfectly matched the gentle confidence he had observed in her patient interactions. The fact that she had taken the initiative to respond showed a courage that he found utterly captivating. But it also complicated everything. How could he possibly reveal himself? The gap between them wasn't just professional. It was a vast chasm of social and economic differences that would make any relationship seem impossible to outsiders. He was the hospital owner, a man whose family name carried weight in the community, whose business decisions affected hundreds of employees. She was a night nurse, dedicated and extraordinary, but someone who might view his attention as inappropriate or even predatory given their positions. His contemplation was interrupted by Margaret's voice over the intercom. "Mr. Morrison, Dr. Whitmore is here for his 9 o'clock appointment." "Send him in," Alexander replied, straightening his tie and assuming the professional mask he wore for all business interactions. James Whitmore entered with the confident stride of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. At 34, he was conventionally handsome in a way that probably appealed to many women: blonde hair, blue eyes, and the kind of easy smile that came naturally to those who had never faced significant rejection. "Alexander, thank you for making time," James said, settling into the chair across from Alexander's desk with casual familiarity that immediately grated on Alexander's nerves. "What can I do for you, James?" Alexander kept his tone professional but cool. "I wanted to discuss some observations I've made about night shift staffing," James began, but Alexander caught the calculating look in his eyes. "Specifically, I think we need to consider promoting some of our most dedicated nurses to positions where their talents can be better utilized." "Go on." Alexander's voice betrayed nothing, but every instinct he possessed was suddenly on high alert. Isabella Chen, for instance, exceptional nurse, beloved by patients and families. I've been thinking she might benefit from a transfer to day shift, perhaps in a supervisory role that would better utilize her skills. Alexander's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on his desk pen. "Miss Chen is being considered for the head nurse position. Any changes to her current assignment would be premature. Actually, that's partly why I'm here," James continued with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I've been getting to know Isabella quite well over the past few weeks. She's mentioned feeling undervalued in her current position, frustrated by the lack of advancement opportunities. The implication in James's words, that he had been having personal conversations with Isabella, that she had confided her professional concerns to him, sent a spike of jealousy through Alexander that he struggled to conceal. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Alexander asked, his tone carefully controlled. "I think Isabella would thrive in an environment where her contributions are more visible, more appreciated. There's actually a position opening at Metropolitan General, head of nursing for their new cardiac wing. Excellent salary, day shift hours, significant autonomy." James leaned forward slightly. "I have connections there. I could arrange an interview." Alexander felt his blood pressure rising. The suggestion that Isabella wasn't appreciated at St. Mary's was insulting enough, but the idea that James Whitmore was actively working to recruit her away from the hospital, away from him, was intolerable. "That's very thoughtful of you," Alexander said with dangerous quiet. "But I hardly think it's appropriate for you to be making career arrangements for other staff members without consulting administration." "Of course not," James replied quickly, though his smile remained confident. "I simply want what's best for Isabella. She deserves to be somewhere she's truly valued." The possessive undertone in James's voice when he said Isabella's name made Alexander's jaw clench. It was becoming increasingly clear that the doctor's interest in Isabella's career advancement was secondary to his personal interest in her. "I appreciate your concern for Miss Chen's professional development," Alexander said, standing to signal the end of the meeting. "However, any decisions regarding staff transfers or promotions will be made through proper administrative channels." James stood as well, but his expression had shifted to something more challenging. "Isabella is a remarkable woman, Alexander. I'd hate to see her talents wasted because of bureaucratic limitations." After James left, Alexander stood at his office window, his mind racing with protective instincts he had never experienced before. The threat was clear. James Whitmore was pursuing Isabella both professionally and personally, using his position and connections to try to win her favor. The irony was bitter. While Alexander wrote anonymous love letters like a lovesick teenager, James Whitmore was making bold moves to insert himself into Isabella's life and career. While Alexander struggled with the propriety of revealing his feelings, his rival was actively working to sweep Isabella away from St. Mary's and away from him. That evening, Isabella arrived for her shift with unusual nervousness. She had checked the message location compulsively throughout the day, wondering if her note had been discovered, if there would be a response, if she had somehow overstepped boundaries by reaching out. As she prepared her medication cart, Dr. Whitmore appeared at the nurse's station with his characteristic, confident smile. "Isabella, you look lovely tonight," he said, leaning against the counter in a way that invaded her personal space slightly. "I was hoping we could grab coffee after your shift. There's something I'd like to discuss with you." Isabella felt a flush of discomfort at his proximity and the assumption in his tone. "That's very kind, Dr. Whitmore, but I'm usually quite tired after my shift." "James, please. And this is actually about your career. I may have found an opportunity that could change everything for you." Before Isabella could respond, a familiar deep voice cut through the conversation like a blade. "Dr. Whitmore, you're needed in emergency. Trauma coming in 5 minutes out." Both Isabella and James turned to see Alexander Morrison standing a few feet away, his honey-colored eyes fixed on James with an intensity that made the air feel charged with tension. Isabella's heart skipped at the sight of him, impeccably dressed even at this late hour, radiating the kind of controlled power that made everyone around him instinctively straighten their posture. "Mr. Morrison," James said with forced casualness, though Isabella caught the flicker of annoyance in his expression. "I was just speaking with Isabella about the trauma patient has multiple fractures and possible internal bleeding," Alexander interrupted smoothly. "Doctor, Martinez specifically requested you." James had no choice but to leave, though he shot a look at Isabella that promised their conversation would continue later. "We'll talk soon, Isabella," he said with meaningful emphasis, before heading toward the elevators. Alexander watched him go, then turned his attention to Isabella. Up close again, she was even more captivating than he remembered. Dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets, delicate features that spoke of both gentleness and hidden strength. Miss Chen, he said formally, though his voice carried a warmth that seemed to wrap around her like a caress. Mr. Morrison, she replied, acutely aware of how her heart was racing simply from his presence. Thank you for... if Dr. Whitmore was needed in emergency... He was, Alexander confirmed, though they both knew that wasn't entirely why he had interrupted. I hope he wasn't pressuring you about anything. Isabella studied his face, surprised by the protective note in his voice. He mentioned a job opportunity, but nothing I hadn't already considered. Alexander's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. The thought of Isabella leaving St. Mary's, leaving him, was more painful than he had anticipated. I hope you know that your work here is valued, he said quietly, more than you might realize. There was something in his tone, something in the way his honey-colored eyes lingered on her face, that made Isabella's breath catch. For a moment, she felt as though he was trying to tell her something important, something that went beyond professional appreciation. Thank you, she whispered. That means a great deal. Alexander nodded once, then walked away before he could say something that would reveal too much. But as Isabella watched his retreating figure, she couldn't shake the feeling that there were depths to Alexander Morrison that his professional facade carefully concealed. And later that night, when she found another note waiting for her, this one responding to her message with words that made her heart soar, she began to wonder if the mystery she was trying to solve was closer than she had ever imagined. Isabella's hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the latest note, her heart already racing before she even read the words. Your courage in reaching out has left me both humbled and terrified. I want nothing more than to reveal myself, to tell you how your compassion has transformed not just the lives of your patients, but mine as well. But I fear that knowing who I am might change everything between us, might make you doubt the sincerity of these words. You asked to meet me, and I find myself caught between desperate longing and protective caution. Give me a little more time to find the courage you've already shown. Until then, know that every moment I observe your kindness, I fall deeper under your spell, your devoted admirer. Isabella pressed the note against her chest, feeling her heart pound against her ribs. The vulnerability in these words was breathtaking. Her mysterious correspondent was clearly struggling with the same fears and desires that had been keeping her awake during her off hours. The fact that he called himself her devoted admirer sent warmth coursing through her entire body. She was so absorbed in rereading the note that she didn't notice Dr. Whitmore approaching until he was directly beside her at the nurse's station. You seem distracted tonight, James observed, his eyes trying to catch a glimpse of the paper in her hands. Good news from home? Isabella quickly folded the note and slipped it into her pocket, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. Just personal correspondence. I was hoping we could finish our conversation from yesterday, James continued, moving closer in a way that made Isabella instinctively step back. The opportunity I mentioned could really be perfect for you. Before Isabella could respond, a commotion erupted from the supply closet nearby. Loud crashing sounds, followed by what sounded distinctly like creative cursing in a deep, familiar voice. Both Isabella and James turned toward the noise just as Alexander Morrison emerged from the supply closet, looking thoroughly disheveled and utterly mortified. His usually perfect hair was mussed, his expensive suit jacket was covered in what appeared to be gauze bandages, and he was holding a clipboard that had somehow gotten tangled in several rolls of medical tape. Mr. Morrison, Isabella called out, concern overriding her surprise. Are you all right? Alexander's honey-colored eyes met hers, and she watched in fascination as a deep blush colored his sharp cheekbones. For a man who commanded boardrooms and made million-dollar decisions without blinking, he looked remarkably like a little boy caught with his hand in the cookie jar. I was conducting an inventory assessment, he said, with as much dignity as he could muster while trying to extract himself from the medical tape. The organization system in there is suboptimal. Isabella bit her lip to suppress a smile, but couldn't hide the amusement dancing in her dark eyes. Would you like some help with that? She asked gently, gesturing toward the tape that had somehow wound itself around his wrist and was now connected to his clipboard. That's quite all right, I can manage, Alexander began, then made the mistake of trying to demonstrate by pulling at the tape. The motion only succeeded in getting his other hand stuck, and somehow managed to catch a roll of gauze that unraveled spectacularly across the floor. Isabella couldn't help it. She started to giggle. Not the polite, professional chuckle she might offer a colleague, but genuine musical laughter that seemed to light up the entire corridor. The sound made Alexander's chest tighten with something that felt dangerously close to adoration. "I'm sorry," Isabella managed, still smiling as she approached him. "I don't mean to laugh, but you look like you've been attacked by the supply closet." "It was a sneak attack," Alexander replied solemnly, though Isabella caught the hint of humor in his eyes. "I suspect the bandages have been planning this ambush for weeks." Isabella's laughter bubbled up again, and she reached out without thinking to help untangle him from the medical tape. Her fingers brushed against his wrist as she worked, and both of them froze at the contact. The laughter died in Isabella's throat as she became acutely aware of how close they were standing, how her hands looked so small against his, how his cologne carried hints of cedar, and something uniquely masculine that made her head feel light. Alexander's breathing had gone shallow. Isabella's touch was gentle and sure, her concentration complete as she worked to free him from his medical tape prison. He found himself studying her face from this close distance. The delicate curve of her cheekbones, the way her dark lashes cast shadows when she looked down, the soft fullness of her lips that he was suddenly desperate to taste. "There," Isabella whispered, successfully freeing his wrist but not immediately stepping away. "You're liberated." "Thank you," Alexander replied, his voice rougher than usual. His eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, the rest of the world seemed to disappear. The busy hospital sounds faded to white noise, the fluorescent lighting seemed to soften, and all that existed was the space between them, charged with possibility. Dr. Whitmore cleared his throat loudly, shattering the spell. "Well, this has been entertaining," he said with barely concealed irritation. "But Isabella, we really should discuss that opportunity I mentioned." The intrusion snapped both Isabella and Alexander back to reality. Isabella stepped away from Alexander quickly, suddenly aware that they had been standing far closer than was professionally appropriate. Alexander's expression shifted back to its usual controlled mask, though his eyes remained fixed on Isabella's face. "Yes, of course," Isabella said, though her voice sounded distant even to her own ears. "Dr. Whitmore, perhaps we could—" "Actually," Alexander interrupted smoothly, his business persona sliding back into place like armor, "I need to speak with Miss Chen about the head nurse position. The selection committee has some questions about her application." Isabella's eyes widened. This was the first she had heard about any questions regarding her application, but something in Alexander's tone suggested there was more to this interruption than official business. James's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, Isabella, perhaps we could meet tomorrow evening instead. I could take you to dinner, somewhere we could talk privately about your future." The possessive undertone in James's voice made Alexander's hands clench at his sides. The idea of Isabella having dinner with the ambitious doctor, of James having hours of her undivided attention to work his considerable charm, was intolerable. "That's very kind," Isabella replied carefully, "but I'm not sure about my schedule." "I'm afraid Miss Chen will be working late tomorrow evening," Alexander cut in, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The head nurse interviews have been moved up, and there will be extensive preparation required." It was a complete fabrication, but Alexander delivered it with such authority that neither Isabella nor James questioned it. Isabella looked at him with surprise, and what might have been gratitude, while James's expression suggested he knew exactly what game was being played. "Well then," James said with forced pleasantness, "I suppose we'll have to find another time. Isabella, I'll be in touch about that opportunity. It really is too good to pass up." After James left, Isabella found herself alone with Alexander in the corridor, acutely aware of the tension that seemed to crackle in the air between them. "Was there really something about my application?" she asked quietly. Alexander studied her face, noting the hope and anxiety warring in her dark eyes. "Your application is excellent," he said honestly, "but I wanted to talk to you about Dr. Whitmore's interest in your career advancement." Isabella tilted her head slightly, confused. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Be careful with him, Isabella," Alexander said, his voice carrying a protective edge that sent shivers down her spine. "Some men use professional opportunities to pursue personal agendas." The way he said her name, not Miss Chen but Isabella, made her heart skip. There was something intimate about it, something that suggested he thought of her as more than just another employee. "I can take care of myself," she replied softly, though she was touched by his concern. "I know you can," Alexander said, his honey-colored eyes intense, "but that doesn't mean you should have to." As he walked away, leaving Isabella standing in the corridor with her heart racing and her mind spinning, she couldn't shake the feeling that Alexander Morrison was far more complex than his professional reputation suggested. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a tiny voice wondered if the protective concern in his voice matched the devoted care in her mysterious correspondence letters. Later that night, as she made her rounds, Isabella found herself smiling every time she thought about Alexander Morrison, tangled in medical tape, looking completely human and adorably flustered. It was a side of him she suspected very few people ever saw, and she felt oddly privileged to have witnessed it. What she didn't know was that 3 floors above, Alexander was sitting in his office, composing another note and trying not to think about how perfect Isabella's laughter had sounded, or how right it had felt to have her hands on his skin, even for those few innocent moments. 3 days had passed since the supply closet incident, and Isabella found herself thinking about Alexander Morrison at the most inappropriate moments. During medication rounds, she would catch herself remembering the way his perfectly styled hair had looked mussed and human. While comforting patients, she would find her mind drifting to the warmth in his honey-colored eyes when he had looked at her with such intensity. And every time she passed the supply closet, she couldn't help but smile at the memory of the most powerful man in the hospital being defeated by medical tape. But it was the protective edge in his voice when he had warned her about Dr. Whitmore that kept replaying in her mind. There had been something possessive in his tone, something that suggested his concern went beyond professional courtesy. Combined with the increasingly romantic letters from her mysterious correspondent, Isabella felt as though she was living in 2 different love stories simultaneously, one unfolding in anonymous written words, the other building through stolen glances and charged moments with a man who was supposed to be completely out of her reach. Isabella was lost in these thoughts as she prepared Mrs. Patterson's evening medications when a familiar voice made her jump. "You look like you're solving the mysteries of the universe," Dr. Whitmore said, appearing at her elbow with his characteristic confident smile. "Just concentrating on dosages," Isabella replied, though her tone was cooler than usual. Alexander's warning had made her more aware of James's behavior, and she was beginning to notice things that had previously seemed like simple friendliness. The way he stood too close, the possessive undertones in his voice, the assumption that she would be interested in his attention. "I've been thinking about our conversation," James continued, ignoring her obvious discomfort. "The position at Metropolitan General is still available, and I really think you should consider it seriously. You're wasting your talents here." Isabella's hands stilled on the medication cart. "I don't consider caring for patients a waste of my talents, Dr. Whitmore. James, please. And that's not what I meant." He moved closer, backing her against the medication cart in a way that made her feel trapped. "You're extraordinary, Isabella. You deserve to be somewhere that recognizes your worth. And you don't think St. Mary's recognizes my worth?" The question came from behind James, delivered in a voice that could have frozen water. Both Isabella and James turned to see Alexander Morrison standing in the corridor, his posture deceptively casual, but his eyes radiating the kind of controlled danger that made smart people step carefully. "Mr. Morrison," James said, though his confident facade cracked slightly, "I was just discussing career opportunities with Isabella." "Were you?" Alexander's tone was conversational, but Isabella caught the steel beneath it. "How thoughtful of you to take such a personal interest in Miss Chen's professional development." Alexander moved closer, and Isabella noticed that despite being roughly the same height as James, Alexander's presence somehow dominated the space completely. It was something about the way he carried himself, the absolute confidence that radiated from every line of his body, the sense that this was a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Isabella is a remarkable nurse," James said, his own voice taking on a slightly challenging edge. "I hate to see talented people held back by institutional limitations." Isabella felt the tension in the air thicken dangerously. While she was flattered by the professional praise, she was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with being discussed as though she weren't standing right there. "Gentlemen," she interjected firmly, "I appreciate your concern for my career, but I'm perfectly capable of making my own professional decisions." Both men turned to look at her, and Isabella felt a surge of satisfaction at the surprise in their faces. Clearly, neither had expected her to assert herself so directly. "Of course you are," Alexander said immediately, his expression softening as his eyes met hers. "I apologize if we gave the impression otherwise." James looked less pleased with her interruption. "Isabella, I only want what's best for you. Sometimes we need outside perspective to see our full potential. And sometimes," Alexander said quietly, his gaze never leaving Isabella's face, "we need to trust that people know their own hearts." There was something in the way he said it, something in the intensity of his gaze, that made Isabella's breath catch. For a moment, she felt as though he was speaking about something far more personal than career decisions. Before anyone could respond, Isabella's pager buzzed urgently. She glanced down to see the code for room 314. Mrs. Patterson was having complications. "I have to go," Isabella said, already moving toward the patient's room. Both men stepped aside to let her pass, but she was too focused on her patient to notice the way Alexander's eyes followed her movement, or the frustrated expression on James's face. Inside room 314, Isabella found Mrs. Patterson in the grip of a severe panic attack, her breathing rapid and shallow, her eyes wild with fear. "Mrs. Patterson, it's Isabella," she said calmly, taking the woman's trembling hands in hers. "You're safe. I'm here with you." "Can't breathe," the elderly woman gasped. "Something's wrong." Isabella quickly checked her vitals, noting the elevated heart rate and blood pressure that confirmed her suspicion of a panic attack rather than a cardiac episode. She sat on the edge of the bed and began speaking in the gentle, soothing tone that had become her trademark. "Let's breathe together," Isabella said, her voice steady and calm. "In through your nose, slow and deep. That's perfect. Now out through your mouth, even slower." She guided Mrs. Patterson through several breathing exercises while monitoring her vitals, her touch gentle but confident as she helped the frightened woman regain control. From the doorway, Alexander watched Isabella work with something approaching awe. He had witnessed her patient interactions before, but seeing her handle a crisis with such skill and compassion reinforced everything he had observed about her character. She wasn't just technically competent, she had an intuitive understanding of what people needed in their most vulnerable moments. "Better?" Isabella asked, as Mrs. Patterson's breathing began to normalize. "Much better, dear," the woman replied, though tears still tracked down her cheeks. "I don't know what came over me, I just felt so afraid, so alone." "Fear is normal," Isabella said gently, "especially when we're in unfamiliar places, dealing with things that feel beyond our control. But you're not alone. I'm here and I'm not going anywhere." She stayed with Mrs. Patterson for another 20 minutes, holding her hand and talking about ordinary, comforting things until the woman finally drifted off to peaceful sleep. When Isabella finally emerged from the room, she was surprised to find Alexander waiting in the corridor. James had apparently given up and left, but Alexander remained, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, his expression thoughtful. "How is she?" he asked. "Better. It was a panic attack, not cardiac. She just needed someone to remind her that she wasn't alone." Isabella smoothed her scrubs self-consciously, aware that she probably looked tired and slightly frazzled. "You have a gift," Alexander said simply. "The way you handled that situation. It's not something that can be taught in nursing school." Isabella felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. Coming from someone of his position and experience, the compliment meant more than she could express. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means a great deal." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the earlier tension with James forgotten. Isabella found herself studying Alexander's profile, noting the strong line of his jaw, the way his honey-colored eyes seemed to hold depths she was only beginning to discover. "Isabella," Alexander said suddenly, his voice carrying an urgency that made her pulse quicken. "About Dr. Whitmore." "I know," she interrupted gently. "I can see what you were trying to warn me about. The way he talks about my career, it doesn't feel entirely professional." Alexander's expression tightened. "If he makes you uncomfortable in any way, I want you to tell me immediately." The protective fierceness in his voice sent shivers down Isabella's spine. "I can handle Dr. Whitmore," she said, though she was touched by his concern. "I know you can," Alexander replied, echoing his words from their previous conversation. "But you shouldn't have to handle him alone." As he walked away, Isabella stood in the corridor feeling as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Between her mysterious correspondence, increasingly romantic letters, and Alexander Morrison's protective attention, she was beginning to feel caught between two impossible dreams. What she couldn't yet see was that they were the same dream, waiting for the courage to reveal itself. Alexander stared at the formal invitation that had arrived at his office that morning, his jaw clenching with familiar frustration. The Morrison family's annual charity gala was in 2 weeks, and attached to the elegant cardstock was a handwritten note from his mother. "Alexander, darling, I've arranged for Victoria Hartwell to be your guest for the evening. Her family is delighted by the prospect of strengthening our business relationship. Please don't disappoint us this time. Mother, Victoria Hartwell, daughter of the Hartwell Medical Group's founder, heiress to a pharmaceutical fortune, and his family's idea of the perfect wife for the Morrison heir. Beautiful, accomplished, socially appropriate, and completely wrong for him in every way that mattered." Alexander crumpled the note and tossed it toward the wastebasket, his mind immediately turning to Isabella. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Victoria represented everything his family valued in terms of social status and financial advantage, while Isabella embodied everything he had come to value in terms of character and genuine worth. The irony was bitter. His family had built their fortune in healthcare, claiming to care about serving others, yet they couldn't see the extraordinary value in someone like Isabella Chen because she didn't come with the right pedigree or bank account. A knock at his office door interrupted his brooding. "Come in," he called, expecting Margaret with the morning reports. Instead, his younger sister Caroline swept into the office with her characteristic dramatic flair. At 34, Caroline Morrison Blackwell was everything their family had raised her to be: elegant, socially connected, and utterly convinced that wealth and breeding were the only measures of a person's worth. "Alexander," she announced, settling into the chair across from his desk without invitation, "we need to discuss your behavior at last month's hospital board dinner." "Good morning to you too, Caroline," Alexander said dryly. "What behavior would that be? Don't play innocent with me. Margaret Whitmore mentioned that you've been distracted lately, asking unusual questions about staff schedules, taking more interest in night shift operations than a hospital administrator typically would." Caroline's eyes narrowed shrewdly. "There are rumors, Alexander." Alexander's blood chilled. If Caroline had heard rumors, it meant other people were beginning to notice his attention to Isabella. In their social circle, gossip spread faster than wildfire, and the potential damage to Isabella's reputation was something he couldn't tolerate. "What kind of rumors?" he asked carefully. "The kind that suggest the Morrison heir might be developing inappropriate feelings for someone beneath his station." Caroline leaned forward, her voice taking on the cutting edge she had perfected since childhood. "Please tell me you're not foolish enough to risk everything father built for some momentary infatuation with a nurse." Alexander's hands clenched into fists beneath his desk. Hearing Isabella referred to dismissively as some nurse sent rage coursing through him, but he forced his expression to remain neutral. "I think you're overestimating the hospital's gossip network," he said evenly. "Am I?" "Because Victoria Hartwell's mother called Mother yesterday, expressing concern about some of the stories circulating about your recent behavior. If the Hartwells are questioning your suitability as a potential husband for Victoria, we have a serious problem." Alexander stood abruptly, moving to the window to hide his expression from his sister's shrewd gaze. The mention of Victoria and the expectations surrounding their arranged relationship made his stomach turn. "I never agreed to marry Victoria Hartwell," he said quietly. "You never disagreed either," Caroline shot back. "Alexander, this isn't just about you. The Hartwell connection could expand our pharmaceutical contracts by 40%. Think about what that would mean for the hospital, for our family's legacy." "I am thinking about the hospital," Alexander replied, though his definition of what was best for St. Mary's had evolved significantly in recent weeks. "But I won't be forced into a marriage for business advantages." Caroline's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Forced? Alexander, you're 38 years old and you've never had a serious relationship that lasted more than 6 months. The family is beginning to wonder if you're capable of the kind of commitment necessary for marriage and children." The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be painful. Alexander had never found anyone who inspired the kind of deep, lasting feelings that he believed marriage should be built on. Until Isabella. "Perhaps I've been waiting for the right person," he said. "The right person would be someone who understands our world, our responsibilities, our expectations. Someone like Victoria." Caroline stood, smoothing her designer skirt with practiced grace. "I hope you'll remember that when you make your decision about the gala. The entire family will be watching." After Caroline left, Alexander slumped back into his chair, feeling the weight of family expectations pressing down on him like a physical force. For 38 years, he had largely managed to avoid the marriage pressure by focusing on his career and the hospital's success. But his family's patience was clearly wearing thin, and their increasing focus on Victoria Hartwell as a suitable bride was becoming impossible to ignore. 3 floors below, Isabella was dealing with her own family pressures, though of a very different nature. Her cell phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Isabella, Mrs. Wong's son is a doctor now. Very handsome, good family. I gave her your number. Be nice when he calls." Isabella sighed, recognizing the familiar pattern. Her mother's well-meaning but relentless matchmaking efforts had intensified since Isabella turned 28. Every family gathering included pointed questions about her dating life, followed by enthusiastic descriptions of various eligible men from their community. The irony wasn't lost on her. While her mother pushed her towards successful professionals who would provide stability and security, Isabella found herself increasingly captivated by 2 impossible relationships: her mysterious correspondent, whose identity remained tantalizingly unknown, and Alexander Morrison, who existed in a completely different social stratosphere. Isabella was contemplating this when she noticed Dr. Whitmore approaching the nurse's station with determined strides and an expression that suggested he wouldn't be easily discouraged this time. "Isabella," he said, his tone more insistent than usual, "I need to speak with you privately." "I'm in the middle of medication rounds," Isabella replied, not looking up from her charts. "This is important. It's about your future." James moved closer, lowering his voice. "The position at Metropolitan General won't wait indefinitely. They need an answer by the end of the week." Isabella finally looked up, noting the urgency in his expression. "Dr. Whitmore, I appreciate your interest in my career, but I haven't asked for your help in finding other positions." "James, please. And I'm offering this help because I care about you, Isabella, more than you might realize." His voice took on an intimate tone that made her uncomfortable. "We could be good together, professionally and personally. The opportunity at Metropolitan could be the start of something significant for both of us." The implication in his words was unmistakable, and Isabella felt a surge of annoyance. "I think you're misunderstanding our relationship, Dr. Whitmore. We're colleagues, nothing more." James's expression hardened slightly. "I think you're selling yourself short, Isabella. A woman with your talents shouldn't limit herself to a place where she'll never be truly appreciated." Before Isabella could respond, a familiar, deep voice cut through the tension. "Miss Chen, could I speak with you about the Patterson case?" Alexander appeared beside them, his timing impeccable as always. His honey-colored eyes took in the scene quickly, noting Isabella's uncomfortable posture and James's possessive proximity. "Of course, Mr. Morrison," Isabella replied, grateful for the interruption. James's jaw tightened with frustration. "We weren't finished discussing—" "Actually, we were," Isabella said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. "If you'll excuse me, Dr. Whitmore." As James stalked away, clearly displeased, Alexander turned his full attention to Isabella. She looked tired, he noticed, and there were lines of stress around her eyes that suggested she was dealing with more than just difficult patients. "Is everything all right?" he asked quietly. Isabella hesitated, then decided that his genuine concern deserved an honest answer. "Dr. Whitmore has been persistent about a job opportunity. I think his interest is becoming more personal than professional." Alexander's expression darkened. "Has he made you uncomfortable?" "Not exactly uncomfortable, just pressured. He seems to think I should be grateful for his attention, both professional and personal." The protective instincts that Alexander had been struggling to control surged to the surface. The idea of James Whitmore pressuring Isabella, making her feel obligated to accept his advances in exchange for career opportunities, was intolerable. "Isabella," Alexander said, his voice carrying an intensity that made her pulse quicken, "you should never feel pressured to accept anyone's attention, professional or otherwise. Your worth isn't dependent on someone else's recognition." The sincerity in his voice, combined with the protective warmth in his honey-colored eyes, made Isabella's heart skip. There was something about the way Alexander Morrison looked at her that made her feel valued and seen in a way she had never experienced before. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more than you know." As Alexander walked away, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that he had been trying to tell her something important, something that went beyond simple workplace courtesy. Combined with her mysterious correspondent's increasingly romantic letters, she found herself caught between two impossible dreams, unaware that they were the same heart reaching out to her in different ways. Later that evening, as Alexander composed another anonymous letter to Isabella, he found himself pouring his frustration with family expectations and his growing feelings for her onto the page. What he didn't realize was that his next note would finally give Isabella the clue she needed to solve the mystery that had been captivating her heart. Isabella arrived at work 30 minutes early, her mind racing with anticipation about finding another note from her mysterious correspondent. The previous evening's letter had been different, more personal, more vulnerable, and she sensed that whoever was writing to her was struggling with the same growing feelings that kept her awake during the day. As she made her way through the quiet corridors toward the nurses' station, Isabella noticed that the administrative offices on the upper floors still had lights on despite the late hour. She had observed this pattern before. Someone in management often worked very late, their office glowing like a beacon in the otherwise darkened administrative wing. Isabella was contemplating this when she heard footsteps echoing from the stairwell. She glanced around, realizing she was completely alone in this section of the hospital. The night shift didn't officially begin for another 20 minutes, and the evening staff had already departed. Curiosity overrode caution as Isabella approached the nurses' station, her heart hammering with the possibility of finally discovering her correspondent's identity. She positioned herself behind a supply cart where she could observe without being seen, and waited. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the soft whisper of expensive fabric. Isabella held her breath as a tall figure emerged from the shadows, moving with the quiet confidence of someone completely familiar with these corridors. Her heart nearly stopped when she recognized the unmistakable profile of Alexander Morrison. He moved directly to the nurses' station, reaching into his jacket pocket to withdraw a folded piece of paper. Isabella watched in stunned silence as he placed the note in the exact location where she always found her mysterious messages, his movements careful and deliberate. For a moment, Alexander stood perfectly still, his hand lingering near the spot where he had placed the letter. Even from her hidden vantage point, Isabella could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his other hand clenched and unclenched at his side. Alexander Morrison, the austere hospital administrator, the man whose mere presence commanded respect and attention, the intimidating businessman who made million-dollar decisions without hesitation. He was her devoted correspondent. He was the person who saw into her heart with such clarity, who understood her fears and dreams with intimate precision. Isabella's mind reeled as pieces of the puzzle suddenly fell into place. His detailed knowledge of her patient interactions, his protective behavior around Dr. Whitmore, the way his honey-colored eyes seemed to hold secrets when he looked at her, the timing of his appearances whenever she needed support. She pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he would hear it. Alexander Morrison, powerful, unattainable, devastatingly attractive Alexander Morrison, had been writing her love letters. Alexander began to turn away from the nurses' station, and Isabella knew she had seconds to make a decision. She could remain hidden, pretend she had never witnessed this moment, and continue their anonymous correspondence. Or she could step forward and change everything between them forever. Before she could fully process her decision, Isabella found herself moving from behind the supply cart, her feet carrying her forward, as though guided by instinct rather than conscious thought. "Mr. Morrison," she said softly. Alexander froze, his entire body going rigid as he slowly turned toward her voice. When his honey-colored eyes met hers, Isabella saw a mixture of emotions flash across his usually controlled features: surprise, mortification, fear, and something that looked remarkably like longing. "Isabella," he breathed, her name escaping his lips like a prayer and a confession all at once. They stood facing each other in the dimly lit corridor, the weight of revelation hanging between them like a physical presence. Isabella could see the careful walls Alexander had built around himself crumbling in real time, leaving him more vulnerable and human than she had ever imagined possible. "You wrote them," Isabella said, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a question. The truth was written in every line of his tense posture, every flicker of emotion in his expressive eyes. Alexander's jaw worked silently for several seconds before he found his voice. "I can explain. The night Mrs. Patterson had her panic attack," Isabella interrupted, pieces continuing to fall into place. "You mentioned in your next letter how I stayed with her, held her hand until she felt safe, but no one else knew those details." Alexander closed his eyes briefly, his carefully constructed facade completely shattered. When he opened them again, Isabella saw raw honesty that took her breath away. "I saw you with her," he admitted quietly. "I was making my administrative rounds when I heard the commotion. I watched you handle the situation with such skill and compassion that He paused, running a hand through his dark hair. "I went back to my office and wrote about it, because I couldn't stop thinking about how extraordinary you were." Isabella's heart clenched at the vulnerability in his voice. This was a man who commanded boardrooms and made decisions that affected hundreds of lives, yet he was standing before her looking utterly uncertain and exposed. "How long?" she asked. "The letters started 3 weeks ago," Alexander replied. "But I've been watching you for much longer than that, observing how you care for patients, how you bring light to the darkest moments in this place. You fascinate me, Isabella. You always have." The confession hung between them like a bridge neither was certain they could cross. Isabella felt dizzy with the implications of what she had discovered. Alexander Morrison, the man she had been developing feelings for during their brief encounters, was the same person who had been touching her heart with beautiful words for weeks. "Why didn't you tell me?" Isabella asked, though she thought she understood the answer. Alexander's expression grew pained. "Look at us, Isabella. Really look. I'm the hospital owner, a man whose family has money and social position. You're a night nurse, extraordinary and perfect, but someone who might think my attention was inappropriate or predatory, given our positions." Isabella stepped closer, drawn by an impulse she couldn't name. "And what do you think?" "I think," Alexander said, his voice rough with emotion, "that I'm a fool who fell in love with a woman so far out of my league that I could only tell her through anonymous letters." The word love hit Isabella like a physical blow, sending shockwaves through her entire system. Alexander Morrison had just confessed to loving her, and the raw honesty in his voice made it impossible to doubt his sincerity. "Out of your league?" Isabella repeated, incredulous. "Alexander, you're the most powerful man in this hospital. You could have anyone you wanted." "Anyone except the only woman who matters," Alexander replied, his honey-colored eyes intense with unspoken longing. "Isabella, you have to understand my family, my social circle, the expectations placed on me. None of that allows for what I feel for you." Isabella's heart broke a little at the pain in his voice. She could see the internal war he was fighting, torn between his growing feelings for her and the weight of family obligations and social expectations. "What do you feel for me?" she asked quietly. Alexander stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his honey-colored eyes, close enough to catch the subtle scent of his cologne that always made her feel light-headed. "I feel like you've turned my entire world upside down," he said softly. "Like every day I don't tell you how extraordinary you are is a day wasted. Like the letters I write to you are the most honest words I've ever put on paper, because they're the only place I can be completely truthful about what you mean to me." Isabella's breathing had gone shallow. They were standing closer than they ever had before. Close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Alexander," she whispered, his name feeling different on her lips now that she knew the truth. He raised his hand slowly, as though asking permission, and when she didn't pull away, he gently traced the curve of her cheek with his fingertips. The touch was electric, sending shivers through Isabella's entire body. "I should stay away from you," Alexander murmured, though his hand remained cupped against her face. "For your sake, for your reputation, for your career. I should pretend this conversation never happened. But you won't, Isabella said, and it wasn't a question. She could see the answer in his eyes, could feel it in the way his thumb gently brushed across her cheekbone. I can't, Alexander admitted. Not anymore. Not now that you know. They stood frozen in that moment, balanced on the edge of something that would change everything between them. Isabella could feel Alexander's internal struggle, could see the war between duty and desire playing out in his expressive eyes. The sound of elevator doors opening in the distance broke the spell, reminding them both that they were standing in a public corridor where anyone might discover them. Alexander dropped his hand reluctantly, stepping back to put proper distance between them. Isabella, he said, his voice carefully controlled once again, I need you to know that nothing I wrote in those letters was manipulative or false. Every word came from my heart. I know, Isabella replied softly. I could feel the sincerity in every sentence. Alexander nodded once, then began to walk away, before stopping and turning back to her. The note I left tonight, he said quietly. Read it when you're alone. It says everything I couldn't find the courage to tell you in person. As Alexander disappeared into the shadows, Isabella stood in the empty corridor with her heart racing and her mind spinning. Everything had changed in the span of a few minutes. Her mysterious correspondent had a face, a name, a heartbreakingly vulnerable confession of love that made her own growing feelings seem suddenly possible and terrifying all at once. When she finally retrieved the note he had left, Isabella's hands were trembling. Whatever Alexander Morrison had written tonight, she knew it would either bring them together or tear them apart forever. Isabella waited until she was safely locked in the staff lounge before unfolding Alexander's final letter. Her hands trembled as she smoothed the paper, recognizing his elegant script, but noting how the writing seemed less controlled than usual, as though emotion had guided his pen more than careful consideration. My dearest Isabella, the letter began, and her heart immediately began racing at the intimate salutation. By the time you read this, you will know the truth about who has been writing to you these past weeks. I suspect you're feeling shocked, perhaps even betrayed that I kept my identity hidden for so long. I hope you can understand that my secrecy came from fear, not deception. I fell in love with you the first night I saw you comforting that frightened child in the emergency room. You sang to him while he waited for surgery, and I watched from the doorway as you transformed his terror into trust with nothing more than your gentle voice and genuine care. In that moment I realized I had never seen anything so beautiful as your compassion in action. But what could I do with such feelings? I am Alexander Morrison, heir to a medical empire, bound by family expectations and social obligations that have been planned since my birth. You are Isabella Chen, a remarkable woman whose worth transcends any artificial measures of status or wealth, but someone my family would never accept as suitable for their son. The letters became my only refuge, the single place where I could be honest about what you mean to me. Every word I wrote was true. Your dedication does illuminate the darkest corners of this place. Your compassion does heal more than just physical ailments. And your presence has transformed not just this hospital, but my entire understanding of what matters in life. I love you, Isabella. Not your position, not your usefulness to my business interests, not any calculated advantage you might provide. I love your heart, your strength, your incredible capacity for caring about others, even when you're exhausted and overwhelmed. I love the way you laugh when something genuinely amuses you, the way you bite your lip when you're concentrating, the way you somehow make even the fluorescent hospital lighting seem warm when you smile. I know this confession complicates everything between us. I know my feelings put you in an impossible position, professionally and personally. If you want to pretend this conversation never happened, if you want to transfer to another department or even another hospital to avoid the awkwardness of seeing me, I will arrange it without question and with the highest recommendations. But if there's even the smallest chance that you might feel something for me too, if the connection I feel between us isn't entirely one-sided, then I need you to know that I am willing to fight for this. I am willing to face my family's disappointment, social censure, professional complications, anything and everything that might try to keep us apart. You deserve to be loved completely, honestly, without reservation or condition. You deserve someone who sees your extraordinary heart and chooses you above all other considerations. I hope desperately, foolishly, completely, that you might consider allowing me to be that person. Forever yours. If you'll have me, Alexander. Isabella read the letter 3 times before the words fully penetrated her consciousness. Alexander Morrison loved her. Not just attraction, not just professional admiration, but deep, genuine love that had driven him to consider abandoning his family's expectations. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she pressed the letter against her chest, feeling her heart pound against the paper. The vulnerability in his words, the raw honesty of his confession, the willingness to sacrifice everything for a chance at happiness with her. It was everything she had dreamed of and never dared to hope for. Isabella thought about every interaction they had shared since that first elevator encounter. The protective way he had interrupted Dr. Whitmore's advances, his concern for her well-being, the intensity in his honey-colored eyes when he looked at her, the gentle touch of his fingers against her cheek earlier tonight. All of it made perfect sense now. Alexander hadn't been maintaining professional distance. He had been fighting his own feelings, while trying to respect boundaries he thought she would want maintained. The sound of her phone buzzing interrupted her emotional chaos. A text from her mother. "Isabella, Dr. Wong's son called. Very interested in meeting you. I told him you would call back tonight. Don't disappoint him." The irony of the timing wasn't lost on her. While her mother pushed her toward a safe, conventional relationship with someone from their community, Isabella found herself holding a love letter from a man who represented everything her practical upbringing had taught her to see as impossible. But Alexander's letter had changed something fundamental in her understanding of what was possible. His willingness to risk everything for love made her own fears seem small and conquerable. Isabella stood up slowly, her decision crystallizing with startling clarity. She loved Alexander Morrison. She had been falling in love with him through his letters for weeks, and falling for him as a man during their brief encounters. The revelation that they were the same person hadn't changed her feelings. It had simply made them possible. She folded his letter carefully and placed it in her pocket, close to her heart. Then she walked out of the staff lounge with purposeful strides, heading toward the elevator that would take her to the administrative floor. It was time to give Alexander Morrison her answer. The administrative floor was eerily quiet as Isabella stepped off the elevator, her heart hammering against her ribs with each step toward Alexander's office. The hallway seemed longer than usual, each fluorescent light casting pools of illumination that only emphasized the shadows between them. Light spilled from beneath Alexander's office door, confirming that he was still there despite the late hour. Isabella paused outside, pressing her hand against her pocket where his letter rested, drawing courage from his written confession of love. She knocked softly, 3 gentle taps that seemed to echo in the empty corridor. "Come in," came Alexander's voice, though she could hear the exhaustion and emotional strain beneath his professional tone. Isabella opened the door to find Alexander standing at his window, his back to the entrance, his shoulders rigid with tension. He hadn't turned around, probably expecting Margaret or a security guard with some routine matter. "Alexander," she said softly. He spun around instantly, his honey-colored eyes widening with surprise and something that looked like hope before being quickly replaced by wariness. "Isabella." Her name escaped his lips like a prayer. "I didn't expect—" "Why are you here?" She closed the door behind her and stepped into his office, noting how the warm lamplight made his features seem softer, more approachable than the harsh fluorescent corridor lighting. "I read your letter," she said simply. Alexander's jaw tensed and she could see him bracing himself for rejection. "And?" Instead of answering immediately, Isabella moved closer, close enough to see the vulnerability he was trying so hard to hide behind his professional mask. "You wrote that you fell in love with me the first night you saw me," she said quietly. "But you never asked when I started falling in love with you." Alexander's breath caught audibly. "Isabella, it was in the elevator," she continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke her truth. "That first morning when you knew my name, when you complimented my patient care, there was something in your eyes, something that made me feel seen in a way I never had before." Alexander took a step toward her, his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "You can't mean that." "Then it was every time you appeared when Dr. Whitmore was pressuring me. The way you protected me without making me feel weak or incapable, The supply closet incident when you looked so human and adorable covered in medical tape. Isabella smiled at the memory, watching Alexander's eyes soften. Every interaction we had made me more curious about the man behind the intimidating reputation. Isabella, you don't understand the complications. I understand that you think your family and social position make us impossible, Isabella interrupted, moving even closer. But what I don't understand is why you get to decide what I can and cannot handle. Alexander's hands clenched at his sides, his control visibly fraying. Because I've seen what happens when people from different worlds try to be together. The pressure, the judgment, the way society will try to tear us apart. Are you ashamed of me? Isabella asked directly, her dark eyes challenging him. What? No! Alexander's response was immediate and fierce. Isabella, you're the most extraordinary person I've ever met. You're kind, intelligent, compassionate, beautiful, inside and out. If anything, I'm not worthy of you. Then stop making decisions for both of us, Isabella said, now close enough to touch him if she reached out. Stop assuming you know what I want or what I can endure. Ask me instead. Alexander stared down at her, his honey-colored eyes intense with barely contained emotion. What do you want, Isabella? I want you to stop hiding behind your fears and family expectations, she said softly. I want you to trust that what we feel for each other is strong enough to weather whatever challenges we face. And what do we feel for each other? Alexander asked, his voice rough with hope and desire. Isabella reached up slowly, placing her hand against his chest, feeling his heart racing beneath her palm. You told me you love me, Alexander. Did you mean it? Every word, he breathed, his hand coming up to cover hers. I love you so much it terrifies me. Then you should know, Isabella whispered, rising up on her toes to bring herself closer to his face, that I love you too. Both versions of you, the man who writes beautiful letters and the one who gets tangled in medical tape. Alexander's control finally shattered completely. His free hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing the delicate line of her cheekbone. Isabella, he murmured, her name a reverent whisper as his head began to lower toward hers. Yes, she breathed, her eyes fluttering closed as she felt his breath warm against her lips. They were a hair's breadth apart, both of them trembling with anticipation when Alexander's office phone rang shrilly, shattering the moment like glass. Both of them froze, the spell broken by the harsh intrusion of reality. Alexander's hand was still cupping Isabella's face, her hand still pressed against his chest, where she could feel his heart racing. The phone continued to ring insistently. I have to, Alexander began reluctantly. I know, Isabella whispered, though neither of them moved apart immediately. Alexander finally stepped back with visible effort, his breathing unsteady as he reached for the phone. Morrison. Isabella watched his expression change as he listened to the caller, seeing him shift back into administrator mode even as his eyes remained fixed on her face. There's been an accident, Alexander said after hanging up. Multi-car collision, several critical patients incoming. They need all available staff. Isabella nodded, already moving toward the door. I should get to the floor. Isabella, wait, Alexander called as she reached for the door handle. She turned back to find him looking at her with an expression of such longing and regret that it took her breath away. This conversation isn't over, he said quietly. No, Isabella agreed, her pulse still racing from their almost kiss. It's not. As they left his office together, heading toward their respective responsibilities, Isabella felt as though everything between them had fundamentally shifted. They had confessed their love, almost kissed, almost crossed the line from friendship into something deeper and more dangerous. The interruption had been frustrating, but perhaps it was also a gift, giving them both time to consider what they were willing to risk for the chance at happiness together. The emergency department exploded into controlled chaos as the first ambulance arrived. Isabella had barely made it to the 7th floor when her pager buzzed with an urgent request for additional nursing staff in the ED. She quickly changed direction, her mind still reeling from the almost kiss with Alexander, but her professional training taking over as she prepared for the crisis ahead. The scene that greeted her was intense but organized. Multiple trauma bays filled with accident victims, medical staff moving with practiced efficiency, and the controlled urgency that marked St. Mary's response to mass casualty events. Isabella, Dr. Whitmore called out as soon as he saw her. Thank God you're here. We need experienced hands for the critical cases. Despite her personal discomfort with James, Isabella pushed aside her feelings and focused on the patients who needed her care. She was assigned to assist with a young mother who had suffered severe injuries while protecting her toddler in the crash. For the next 4 hours, Isabella worked alongside the trauma team with unwavering focus. Her gentle manner proved invaluable in calming frightened family members, while her clinical skills helped stabilize multiple patients. She moved between cases with practiced grace, offering comfort to the scared and professional competence to the medical team. Alexander appeared in the emergency department 2 hours into the crisis, ostensibly to assess the hospital's response, but really to check on Isabella. He positioned himself where he could observe without interfering, watching as she demonstrated exactly why he had fallen in love with her. "She's remarkable," Dr. Martinez commented, following Alexander's gaze to where Isabella was gently explaining a procedure to an elderly patient's anxious daughter. "I've worked with nurses from the most prestigious hospitals, but I've never seen anyone with her combination of technical skill and emotional intelligence." Alexander felt a surge of pride so intense it was almost physical. "Yes, she is. Shame about Whitmore's interest in her," Dr. Martinez continued casually. "He's been making it pretty clear that he considers her his territory. Even mentioned something about them having a future together at Metropolitan General." Alexander's blood turned to ice. "What did you say?" "Whitmore's been telling people that Isabella is considering a position at Metropolitan and that he's the one who arranged it. The way he talks, you'd think they were practically engaged." Dr. Martinez shrugged. "Though I have to say, she doesn't seem particularly interested when he's around her." Alexander's hands clenched into fists as he watched James approach Isabella at the central station, his body language possessive and familiar, in a way that made Alexander's jaw clench with jealousy. "Isabella," James said loudly enough for others to hear, "you've been incredible tonight. This is exactly the kind of crisis management that would make you perfect for the head nurse position at Metropolitan." Isabella looked up from her charting, fatigue evident in her dark eyes. "Dr. Whitmore, I haven't said I was interested in that position." "But you should be," James pressed, moving closer in a way that made Isabella step back instinctively. "A woman with your talents deserves better than the limited opportunities here. At Metropolitan, you'd have real advancement potential, better compensation, and—" he lowered his voice meaningfully, "someone who truly appreciates your value." The implication in his tone was unmistakable, and Isabella felt a flash of anger at his presumption. "I appreciate your concern for my career, but—" "Actually," Alexander's voice cut through the conversation like a blade, "Miss Chen's advancement opportunities at St. Mary's are quite extensive." Both Isabella and James turned to see Alexander approaching, his expression carefully controlled, but his honey-colored eyes blazing with barely contained anger. "Mr. Morrison," James said with forced pleasantness, though his jaw tightened with irritation. "I was just discussing Isabella's career prospects with her." "Were you?" Alexander's tone was deceptively mild, but Isabella caught the steel beneath it. "How thoughtful of you to take such a personal interest in Miss Chen's professional development." The tension between the two men was palpable, and Isabella found herself caught in the middle of what felt like a territorial dispute. Other staff members were beginning to notice the charged atmosphere, and she realized this confrontation could quickly become the subject of hospital gossip. "Gentlemen," Isabella interjected firmly, "perhaps this discussion could wait until—" "Actually, Isabella," James interrupted, his voice taking on a challenging edge, "I think it's important that you understand all your options. Mr. Morrison might have his own reasons for wanting to keep you at St. Mary's, but you deserve to know about opportunities elsewhere." The insinuation in James's words that Alexander might have ulterior motives for wanting Isabella to stay sent a spike of protective fury through Alexander that he struggled to control. "Dr. Whitmore," Alexander said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of dangerous calm that made smart people step carefully. "I think there might be some confusion about your role in Miss Chen's career planning." "Is there?" James challenged, "because I was under the impression that staff members were free to pursue opportunities that best serve their professional interests." "Of course they are," Alexander replied smoothly. But I'm curious about your sudden interest in recruitment for other hospitals. One might wonder if your motivations are entirely professional." The accusation hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. James's face flushed with anger, while Isabella looked between the two men with growing concern. "My motivations," James said with barely controlled fury, "are to ensure that exceptional nurses like Isabella aren't held back by institutional limitations." "And what limitations would those be?" Alexander asked, his tone conversational but his eyes deadly serious. Before James could respond, Isabella stepped between them, her patience finally exhausted. "Stop," she said firmly, her voice carrying an authority that made both men immediately focus on her. "Both of you. We're in the middle of a crisis situation, with patients who need our attention, and you're standing here having some kind of territorial dispute about my career, as if I'm not capable of making my own decisions." Alexander looked stricken, realizing how their confrontation must appear to Isabella. "Isabella, I didn't mean— I don't care what you meant," Isabella continued, her dark eyes flashing with anger. "Doctor Whitmore, I am not interested in the position at Metropolitan General, and I am not interested in your personal attention. Please stop pressuring me about both." James's face went red with embarrassment and anger. "Isabella, you're making a mistake." "The only mistake I'm making," Isabella said coldly, "is allowing this conversation to continue in a public space where it could affect patient care and staff morale." She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving both men standing in the emergency department, with the uncomfortable awareness that they had behaved badly and that their confrontation had been witnessed by several colleagues. Alexander watched Isabella's retreating figure with a mixture of admiration and self-recrimination. She was absolutely right. He had allowed his jealousy and protective instincts to override his professional judgment, creating exactly the kind of public scene that could damage her reputation. As the crisis wound down and the last patients were admitted or discharged, Alexander found himself alone in his office, staring out at the city lights and contemplating how badly he had handled the situation. Isabella had trusted him with her feelings, had confessed her love and been willing to risk everything for a relationship with him, and he had responded by engaging in a public confrontation that could only make her position at the hospital more difficult. He had to find a way to apologize, to prove that he could be worthy of the extraordinary woman who had captured his heart. But first, he had to figure out how to protect Isabella from the consequences of his own jealous behavior. Isabella spent the remainder of her shift avoiding both Alexander and Dr. Whitmore, throwing herself into patient care with an intensity that didn't go unnoticed by her colleagues. By morning, she was exhausted both physically and emotionally, her mind replaying the confrontation in the emergency department and questioning whether she had been naive to think a relationship with Alexander could work. She was gathering her belongings from her locker when Maria appeared beside her, coffee in hand and concern written across her face. "Rough night?" Maria asked gently. Isabella managed a tired smile. "You could say that. I heard there was some drama in the ED between Morrison and Whitmore. Something about you being in the middle of it?" Isabella's heart sank. If Maria had already heard gossip, it meant the confrontation had indeed become the subject of hospital speculation. "It was just a misunderstanding about career opportunities." "Isabella," Maria said seriously, "you know I love you like a sister, so I'm going to ask this directly. Is there something going on between you and Mr. Morrison?" The question hit Isabella like a physical blow. If her best friend was asking, how many other people were wondering the same thing? "Why would you ask that?" Isabella replied carefully. "Because I've seen the way he looks at you during staff meetings. And last night, when Whitmore was getting aggressive about that job offer, Morrison looked like he wanted to throw him through a window." Maria studied Isabella's face intently. "Plus, you've seemed different lately. Happier, but also more distracted." Before Isabella could formulate a response, her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced down to see Alexander's name, and her heart immediately began racing. "Can we talk? I owe you an apology." Isabella stared at the message, her emotions warring between the desire to see him and the fear that any further contact would only fuel more gossip. "Is that him?" Maria asked, noting Isabella's expression. Isabella nodded reluctantly. "Honey, be careful," Maria said gently. "I'm not saying you shouldn't be happy, but men like Morrison live in a different world. They have different rules, different expectations. I just don't want to see you get hurt." Isabella appreciated her friend's concern, but Maria's words only reinforced her own doubts about whether a relationship with Alexander was possible. 2 hours later, Isabella found herself in the small coffee shop across from the hospital, having agreed to meet Alexander despite her reservations. She chose a corner table where they could talk privately, her hands wrapped around a warm mug as she waited. Alexander arrived precisely on time, looking impeccable as always, but with lines of stress around his honey-colored eyes that suggested he had slept as little as she had. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly as he sat across from her. "I almost didn't," Isabella admitted. Alexander's expression tightened with pain, but he nodded. "I wouldn't have blamed you. My behavior last night was inexcusable." "It wasn't just your behavior," Isabella said. "Dr. Whitmore was equally inappropriate. But Alexander, the way you two talked about me, as if I wasn't standing right there capable of making my own decisions." "You're absolutely right," Alexander interrupted. "I let my jealousy override my respect for your autonomy, and I'm deeply sorry. You trusted me with your feelings, and I responded by creating exactly the kind of public scene that could damage your reputation." Isabella studied his face, seeing genuine remorse in his expression. "People are already talking." Alexander's jaw clenched. "What are they saying?" "Maria heard about the confrontation. She asked me directly if there was something between us." Isabella took a sip of her coffee, trying to calm her nerves. "If my best friend is asking questions, how many others are wondering the same thing?" "I'll handle it," Alexander said immediately. "I'll make it clear that the confrontation was about hospital policies, not personal matters." "And what about us?" Isabella asked quietly. "What happens to what we confessed to each other last night?" Alexander reached across the table, covering her hand with his. The simple touch sent warmth shooting up her arm, reminding her of how right it felt to be close to him. "I meant every word I said to you," Alexander said intensely. "I love you, Isabella, but I realize now that loving you means protecting you, even from the consequences of my own behavior." Isabella felt her heart clench. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe we need to slow down, be more careful about how we handle this. I won't put your career or reputation at risk because I can't control my jealousy." Isabella was about to respond when disaster struck in the most unexpected way. As Alexander leaned forward to emphasize his point, his elbow knocked over Isabella's coffee mug, sending hot liquid cascading across the table and directly into her lap. Isabella jumped up with a sharp gasp, her scrubs soaked with coffee, while Alexander shot to his feet looking mortified. "Isabella, I'm so sorry, Alexander grabbed a handful of napkins and, without thinking, began dabbing at the coffee stain on her thighs. "Alexander!" Isabella squeaked, her face flushing crimson as she realized he was essentially patting down her legs in the middle of a crowded coffee shop. Alexander froze, suddenly realizing what he was doing. His face went completely red as he looked up at her, napkins still in hand, positioned in what could only be described as a compromising angle. "I was just trying to—" he began, then seemed to realize how his explanation might sound. Isabella couldn't help it. Despite her embarrassment, she started to laugh. Not the polite chuckle she might offer in a professional setting, but genuine musical laughter that filled the coffee shop and made several other patrons turn to look at them. "You're adorable when you're flustered," she managed between giggles. Alexander straightened slowly, his dignity in tatters, but his eyes lighting up at the sound of her laughter. "I was trying to be helpful." "You were trying to feel me up in public," Isabella said, still laughing. "I was not," Alexander protested, though his face remained red. "I was attempting to prevent staining." Isabella's laughter intensified, and after a moment, Alexander began to smile despite his embarrassment. Soon he was laughing too, both of them standing in the coffee shop soaked in caffeine and completely forgetting their previous serious conversation. "We should probably get you cleaned up," Alexander said eventually, gesturing toward her coffee-stained scrubs. "Probably," Isabella agreed, though she was still smiling, "unless you want to cause more gossip by escorting me to a clothing store." Alexander's expression sobered slightly as he remembered their earlier discussion about reputation and discretion, but then he looked at Isabella's bright smile, her dark eyes still dancing with amusement, and made a decision that surprised them both. "Let them talk," he said quietly. Isabella, I'm tired of hiding how I feel about you. If people are going to speculate anyway, maybe it's time to give them something real to speculate about. Isabella's laughter faded as she processed his words. What are you saying? I'm saying that I want to try this, really try. Not hiding in shadows or communicating through letters, but actually dating like two people who care about each other. Alexander stepped closer, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper. If you're willing to take the risk with me. Isabella looked into his honey-colored eyes and saw determination replacing the careful caution that had marked their previous interactions. The Alexander Morrison standing before her was done hiding, done letting fear dictate his choices. What about your family? Your social obligations? Let me worry about my family, Alexander said firmly. The question is whether you're willing to find out if what we have is strong enough to weather whatever challenges we face. Isabella considered his words, thinking about Maria's warnings, her mother's expectations, the hospital gossip that would inevitably follow. Then she thought about Alexander's letters, his protective jealousy, the way her heart raced every time he looked at her. Yes, she said simply. I'm willing to try. Alexander's smile was radiant, transforming his entire face. Good, because I have an idea about how to make our first official date memorable. Please tell me it doesn't involve medical supplies, Isabella said with mock concern. I make no promises, Alexander replied, his eyes twinkling with mischief. But I can guarantee it will be better than coffee shop disasters. As they left the cafe together, both of them coffee-stained but laughing, Isabella felt as though they had crossed some invisible threshold. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The Morrison family's charity gala was in full swing when Alexander made his entrance, but instead of the elegant Victoria Hartwell on his arm, he was accompanied by Isabella Chen. She wore a simple but stunning midnight blue dress that complemented her delicate features perfectly, her dark hair styled in an elegant updo that showcased the graceful line of her neck. Alexander had spent considerable effort preparing Isabella for this evening, knowing that his family's reaction would be swift and potentially brutal. But as he looked at her now, radiant with quiet confidence, despite the intimidating social setting, he felt nothing but pride and protective love. Are you ready for this? He murmured as they approached the ballroom entrance. Isabella's hand tightened slightly on his arm, but her voice was steady. With you? I'm ready for anything. The effect of their entrance was immediate and dramatic. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as heads turned to identify Alexander's unexpected companion. Isabella felt the weight of hundreds of curious, judgmental gazes, but Alexander's steady presence beside her kept her spine straight and her chin raised. Alexander Morrison, what on earth do you think you're doing? The sharp voice belonged to his mother, Eleanor Morrison, who approached them with the kind of controlled fury that only decades of social training could produce. Mother, Alexander replied calmly, I'd like you to meet Isabella Chen. Isabella, this is my mother, Eleanor Morrison. Isabella extended her hand graciously, though she could feel the older woman's disapproval radiating like cold waves. Mrs. Morrison, thank you for including me this evening. Eleanor's handshake was perfunctory at best. Miss Chen, I was under the impression that Victoria Hartwell would be Alexander's guest tonight. Plans changed, Alexander said smoothly, his arm tightening protectively around Isabella's waist. I decided to bring someone who actually matters to me. The statement sent ripples of shock through the nearby guests who were pretending not to eavesdrop. Eleanor's face went white with barely contained rage. Alexander, a word, privately. It wasn't a request. Anything you need to say to me can be said in front of Isabella, Alexander replied firmly. Eleanor's eyes flashed dangerously. Very well, this person is clearly unsuitable for someone of your position. I don't know what temporary infatuation has clouded your judgment, but I will not allow you to embarrass our family for some passing fancy. Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks at being referred to as this person and a passing fancy. But before she could respond, Alexander stepped forward with deadly calm. Mother, you will speak to Isabella with respect, or you will not speak to her at all. She is not a passing fancy. She is the woman I love, and she deserves your courtesy if not your approval. The word love, spoken so publicly, sent murmurs through the growing crowd of onlookers. Isabella's heart swelled with emotion at Alexander's fierce defense of her. even as she realized the cost this confrontation would have for his family relationships. Love? Eleanor's laugh was sharp and bitter. Alexander, you're 38 years old. Surely you understand the difference between infatuation and the kind of practical partnership that sustains a marriage. I understand the difference between a business arrangement and genuine feeling, Alexander replied. And I choose genuine feeling. Before Eleanor could respond, Caroline Morrison Blackwell appeared beside them, her expression calculating as she assessed the situation. Alexander, perhaps we should discuss this somewhere more private, Caroline suggested, her eyes flickering toward the interested audience they had attracted. I'm done discussing my personal life with the family, Alexander said firmly. Isabella and I are together. You can accept that gracefully, or you can continue to embarrass yourselves with public scenes, but you will not change my mind. The confrontation might have escalated further, but it was interrupted by an unexpected voice. Is everything all right here? Dr. Whitmore appeared beside them, impeccably dressed and wearing his most charming smile. Isabella, you look stunning tonight. Isabella felt Alexander tense beside her, as James positioned himself slightly too close, his presence immediately shifting the dynamic of the already volatile situation. Dr. Whitmore, Eleanor said with obvious relief, how lovely to see you. I wasn't aware you would be attending. The Whitmore family has been supporting this charity for years, James replied smoothly. Though I have to say, I'm surprised to see Isabella here. I thought you were considering that position at Metropolitan General we discussed. The implication was clear, that Isabella had been keeping her options open professionally and perhaps personally. Alexander's jaw clenched with familiar jealousy, but Isabella stepped forward before he could respond. Dr. Whitmore, I thought I made my position clear. I'm not interested in the job at Metropolitan, and I'm not interested in your personal attention. Her voice was calm but firm, carrying clearly to the interested onlookers. I'm here with Alexander because I choose to be here with him. James's confident mask slipped slightly, his eyes hardening with wounded pride. Isabella, you're making a mistake. Morrison is playing games with you. Men like him don't marry women like you. They just use them until something better comes along. The insult hit its target, and Isabella felt tears prick her eyes despite her determination not to let James's cruelty affect her. But before she could respond, Alexander stepped forward with dangerous calm. Dr. Whitmore, you have exactly 10 seconds to apologize to Isabella before I have security escort you out of this building. Alexander, please, Isabella said quietly, placing her hand on his arm. He's not worth it. Alexander looked down at Isabella, seeing the hurt in her dark eyes despite her brave composure. In that moment, surrounded by his disapproving family and cruel gossips, he realized that words weren't enough. Isabella needed him to show everyone present exactly how he felt about her. You're right, Alexander said softly, his honey-colored eyes intense with love and determination. He's not worth it, but you are worth everything. Before Isabella could ask what he meant, Alexander cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. Not a gentle, polite kiss appropriate for a public setting, but a deep, passionate kiss that left no doubt about his feelings for her. Isabella's eyes fluttered closed as she melted into him, her hands fisting in his tuxedo jacket as she kissed him back with equal fervor. The rest of the ballroom faded away. The gasps of shock, the disapproving murmurs, the flash of camera phones, until there was nothing but Alexander's lips on hers and the feeling of finally being claimed publicly by the man she loved. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, the ballroom had fallen into stunned silence. Alexander kept his hands on Isabella's face, his thumb gently brushing away a tear that had escaped during their kiss. I love you, he said clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. I don't care who approves or disapproves. You're mine, if you'll have me. Isabella's smile was radiant despite her tears. Always, she whispered. The crowd began to murmur again, some disapproving, some curious, some clearly charmed by the romantic drama they had witnessed. Eleanor Morrison looked apoplectic, while Caroline appeared to be calculating the social ramifications. Dr. Whitmore had disappeared entirely, apparently unwilling to witness his final defeat. Well, Alexander said, offering Isabella his arm with perfect composure despite having just caused the social scandal of the season. Shall we dance? I believe they're playing our song. Isabella laughed, her earlier nerves replaced by joy and confidence. "We have a song?" "We do now," Alexander replied, leading her toward the dance floor as the orchestra began a romantic waltz. As they danced, holding each other close while the cream of society watched and whispered around them, Isabella felt as though she was living in a fairy tale. Alexander's strong arms held her securely, his honey-colored eyes never leaving her face as they moved together in perfect harmony. "No regrets," he murmured, as they swayed to the music. Isabella looked into his eyes, seeing love and devotion and the promise of a future together, despite whatever challenges they might face. "None," she said firmly, "not a single one. Whatever came next, they would face it together, and that was all that mattered." 6 months later, Isabella stood in the conference room of St. Mary's Hospital, her heart racing as she faced the promotion committee. The head nurse position was finally being decided, and despite everything that had happened, the public relationship with Alexander, the family drama, the gossip that had gradually died down, she had made it to the final round of interviews. "Miss Chen," Dr. Martinez began, "your patient satisfaction scores are exceptional, your clinical skills are outstanding, and your leadership during crisis situations has been noted by multiple department heads. However, we need to address the elephant in the room." Isabella's stomach tightened. She had known this moment would come, the question of whether her relationship with Alexander had influenced her candidacy. "Your relationship with Mr. Morrison," Dr. Martinez continued. "Some have suggested that it might create conflicts of interest or give you unfair advantages." Isabella straightened her shoulders, drawing on the confidence Alexander had helped her build over the past months. "Dr. Martinez, I understand the concern, but I would ask you to evaluate my work based on its own merits. Every patient I've cared for, every crisis I've handled, every improvement I've suggested for patient care protocols, none of that was influenced by my personal relationship. If anything, I've held myself to higher standards knowing that people would be watching for any sign of favoritism." The committee members exchanged glances, and Isabella could see them weighing her words against their preconceptions. "Furthermore," Isabella continued, "Mr. Morrison has deliberately excluded himself from any decisions regarding my promotion to ensure complete fairness. If you choose to promote me, it will be because you believe I'm the best candidate for the position, not because of any personal relationships." 20 minutes later, Isabella emerged from the conference room with a letter of promotion in her hands and tears of joy streaming down her face. She had done it entirely on her own merits, with no assistance from Alexander's position or influence. She found Alexander waiting in his office, pacing nervously despite his attempts to appear calm. "Well?" he asked as soon as she entered, though her radiant smile had already given him his answer. "Head nurse Isabella Chen reporting for duty," she said formally, then broke into delighted laughter as Alexander swept her into his arms and spun her around. "I'm so proud of you," he murmured against her hair. "You earned this completely on your own." "I know," Isabella said with satisfaction, "and that makes it even sweeter." Alexander set her down gently, his hands remaining on her waist as he looked into her dark eyes with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Isabella, there's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice carrying an unusual nervousness that made her heart skip. "What is it?" Instead of answering immediately, Alexander reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a familiar piece of paper, one of his original love letters to her. "Do you remember what I wrote in my very first note to you?" he asked. Isabella smiled softly. "You wrote that my dedication illuminated the darkest corners of the hospital. And do you remember what I wrote in my last anonymous letter?" Isabella's breath caught as she recalled the words that had changed everything between them. "You wrote that you loved me and wanted to fight for us." Alexander nodded, then slowly got down on one knee, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Isabella's hands flew to her mouth as she realized what was happening. "Isabella Chen," Alexander said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his honey-colored eyes. "You have illuminated every corner of my life, not just this hospital. You've taught me what real love feels like, what it means to put someone else's happiness before my own, what courage looks like when it's backed by genuine commitment." He opened the box to reveal a stunning but elegant ring, a single perfect diamond surrounded by smaller stones that caught the light like stars. "I promise to love you completely, protect you fiercely and support your dreams unconditionally for the rest of our lives," Alexander continued. "Will you marry me?" Isabella was crying now, tears of pure joy streaming down her face as she looked at the man who had captured her heart with written words and won her soul with his actions. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, absolutely, yes." Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, then stood to kiss her with all the passion and promise of their future together. "I love you," Isabella murmured against his lips. "So much." "I love you too," Alexander replied, "and I have one more surprise." He reached into his desk again and withdrew a final letter, this one written on formal hospital stationery. "What's this?" Isabella asked, still glowing from their engagement. "Read it," Alexander said with a mysterious smile. Isabella unfolded the letter and gasped as she read the official announcement of a new hospital wing dedicated to innovative patient care programs, the Isabella Chen Center for Compassionate Medicine. "Alexander," she breathed, "you can't be serious." "Completely serious. The board approved it unanimously when I presented your patient care innovations. Your ideas about integrating emotional support with medical treatment, your protocols for family communication, your approach to staff wellness, they're going to revolutionize how we deliver healthcare." Isabella looked up at him with wonder and disbelief. "But the cost, the logistics, are all covered. Consider it an engagement present and an investment in the future of medicine." Alexander cupped her face gently. "You've changed this hospital for the better, Isabella. Now you'll be able to change healthcare for thousands of future patients." Epilogue. 1 year later, in the early morning light of their bedroom, Isabella woke with a familiar flutter in her stomach. Her hand instinctively moved to her still flat abdomen as she processed the signs her body had been giving her for the past week. Beside her, Alexander stirred in his sleep, his arm tightening around her waist in an unconscious gesture of protection and love. Isabella studied his peaceful face, marveling at how relaxed and happy he looked compared to the tense, controlled man she had first met. Their wedding 6 months earlier had been perfect, an elegant but intimate ceremony attended by close friends and colleagues, with Mrs. Patterson serving as an honorary grandmother figure and Maria as maid of honor. Even Eleanor Morrison had eventually come around, though it had taken time and considerable effort on Alexander's part. The pregnancy test Isabella took an hour later confirmed what her heart already knew. She stared at the positive result with tears of joy streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the blessing she was carrying. When Alexander woke to find her sitting by the window with tears on her cheeks and a radiant smile on her face, he understood immediately. "Really?" he asked softly, his voice filled with wonder. Isabella nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in her throat. Alexander crossed the room slowly, as if afraid to break the spell, then knelt beside her chair and gently placed his hand over her still flat stomach. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "We've been waiting for you." He looked up at Isabella with tears in his own eyes. "I love you both already, more than I ever thought possible." Isabella threaded her fingers through his dark hair, marveling at how her life had transformed from lonely night shifts to this moment of perfect happiness. "Do you remember what you wrote in your very last letter?" she asked softly. Alexander smiled, remembering, "That I hope to love you forever." "Well," Isabella said, her voice full of joy and promise, "forever is just beginning." As the morning sun streamed through their bedroom window, Alexander kissed Isabella's hand where his ring sparkled on her finger, then pressed another gentle kiss to her stomach, where their child was beginning to grow. In that moment, surrounded by golden light and infinite possibility, they both knew that their love story, which had begun with anonymous letters in a hospital corridor, would continue to unfold in ways more beautiful than either had ever dared to dream. Leave your comment and share this story with someone special. It truly helps us keep bringing new stories to you. And if you want to follow every chapter of this emotional journey, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Your support makes all the difference,